There is a particular kind of theft that the law of the 19th century did not have adequate language to describe, not because it did not happen, but because the people it happened to were not the people the law had been designed to protect. It happened constantly, in the mill towns and the market towns and the growing industrial cities of post-war America, in the spaces between what a woman could build with her hands and her mind and her relentless refusal to accept the limits that the world had placed around her, and what the law would allow her to hold. A woman could make something. She could build it from the raw materials of her own intelligence and her own labor, and her own specific understanding of what the market needed and how to provide it. She could build it carefully and well and over years of work that cost her more than anyone around her was required to acknowledge. And then, through the mechanism of a partnership or a marriage or a legal structure that had been designed by men for the benefit of men, the thing she had built could be taken from her with perfect legality and no remedy available that she could access alone. The law did not call this theft. It did not have a name for it at all. The women it happened to had names for it. The names were not repeatable in polite company. Her name was Frances Holt. She had been born Frances Eliza Holt in the town of Dunmore, Pennsylvania, in the year 1849, the second of four children of a man who cut stone for the building trade and a mother who took in mending, and managed the household of four children, and a working husband with the specific, unacknowledged competence of women who have no alternative to competence, and who develop it therefore to an extraordinary degree. Frances had grown up watching her mother manage things, watching the specific intelligence that goes into the management of a household that has very little to manage with, and that must therefore be managed with exceptional precision. And she had absorbed this intelligence, the way children absorb the most important things they learn, not from being taught it directly, but from being in its presence so constantly that it becomes part of the way she thought about everything. She had also grown up watching the textile trade that was the primary industry of the Dunmore Valley, the mills that lined the river and that employed most of the men of the town, and a significant portion of the women in the less skilled positions. And she had developed from this watching a detailed understanding of how cloth was made, and how it moved from the loom to the merchant to the customer, and where the value was added at each stage and where, if you were positioned correctly, the best margin lay. She had not been formally educated in commerce. She had been educated in it by the specific curriculum of a woman who pays close attention to the economic world around her, because the economic world around her is the world that is going to determine the shape of her life, and she intends to understand it as fully as possible before it closes around her. She came to Harwick Falls in 1871, at the age of 22, following the work. Dunmore's mills had contracted in the 2 years after the war's disruptions to the supply chains had worked their way through the economy, and the work that had been available had reduced itself to a level that the town's population could not adequately support, and the people who were able to find work elsewhere had gone to find it. Frances had heard about the Harwick Falls textile operation from a cousin who had gone there the previous year, and who reported that the town was expanding, that new mill capacity was being built along the river, and that the demand for skilled hands in the finishing and inspection work that the mills required was real, and was paying at rates better than Dunmore had been offering. She arrived in Harwick Falls in April of 1871, with the savings she had accumulated from 3 years of work in Dunmore's mills, and the specific intention of not spending those savings on anything other than the thing she had been planning since she was 18 years old and had first understood, from watching the merchants who bought the mill's output and sold it at prices that made the mill owner's margins look modest, where the real money in the textile trade was. It was not in making cloth. It was in finishing it, in the specific work of dyeing and pressing and trimming that transformed raw mill output into the kind of goods that the growing middle-class households of industrial Pennsylvania were willing to pay premium prices for. The mills made cloth. The finishers made it into something people wanted to own. And the finishing operations in Harwick Falls were, when Frances arrived, not meeting the demand that the mill's growing output was creating. She rented a room in a boarding house on the eastern side of the town, and she spent the first 3 months working in one of the existing finishing shops on the riverfront, learning the specific operations of the Harwick Falls trade and the specific gaps in it that her 3 months of observation confirmed were as real as she had believed them to be from her cousin's account. She worked with the focused attention of someone who is not primarily interested in the work they are doing, but in the information the work is providing. And by the end of the 3 months, she had a complete picture of what the market needed and what was not being provided, and how the gap between those two things could be filled by someone with the right approach. She opened Holt's Finishing in October of 1871 in a rented ground floor space on the southern end of the mill district, a space that had previously been used for storage, and that she spent 2 weeks cleaning and fitting out with the equipment she had identified as the minimum necessary for the operations she intended to offer. She hired 2 women from the finishing shop where she had worked, women whose capabilities she had assessed across 3 months of working beside them, and who she paid at rates slightly above what they had been receiving, which meant she got the best available, and which cost her more than the alternative, and which she had calculated was worth it because the quality of the work was the whole of her competitive position. She was 22 years old, and she had 3 months of Harwick Falls market knowledge and 4 years of savings and 2 employees, and the specific, clear-eyed confidence of a woman who has thought very carefully about what she is doing and has satisfied herself that the thinking is sound. Holt's Finishing was profitable within 6 months. Not dramatically, not in the way of the stories that compress years of difficult building into a sentence. Profitable in the real way, in the way of a small operation that has correctly identified a genuine market need and is serving it competently, which produces margins that are modest and consistent, and that compound over time into something substantial if managed well. Frances managed it well. She kept her accounts with the precision her mother had taught her by example. She reinvested carefully, adding capacity when the orders justified it and not before. She maintained the quality of the work by staying present in the operation, rather than removing herself from it as it grew, because she understood that the quality was the whole of the reason her customers were choosing her over the alternatives. By 1874, she had 6 employees and had moved into a larger space on the north end of the mill district, and had established relationships with 4 of the major mill operators in Harwick Falls as her primary customers. She was 25 years old, and she had built something real from nothing, and she knew it, and she was, in the specific way of a woman who has worked harder than most people around her for longer than most would have sustained it, satisfied in the deep and durable way that comes from having done something that deserved to be done well, and having done it well. It was in 1874 that she met Arthur Kane. Arthur Kane was 31 years old, a man who had come to Harwick Falls from Philadelphia 2 years before with a background in commercial sales, and a manner that was the manner of someone who has spent years in the company of people with more money than himself, and has learned to present himself as their equal. He was tall and well-dressed in the specific way of a man who invests in his appearance, because he understands it as a commercial asset, and he spoke with the fluency of someone who has been trained in persuasion, not as a talent but as a technique. And he was charming in the way that charming people are charming, which is to say in a way that is not false, but is not quite the same as genuine warmth, in a way that produces the sensation of warmth without its substance. He called at Holt's Finishing in the capacity of a commercial representative for a Philadelphia supplier of dyestuffs, and he conducted the business of his visit with the professional competence of a man who knows his product and his market. And then he asked Frances if he could speak with the owner about a larger supply arrangement. She told him she was the owner. He looked at her with an expression she recognized as the expression of a man recalibrating what he expected to see. And then he adjusted and proceeded with the same professional fluency he had applied to the opening of the conversation. And she noted the adjustment and what it meant, and filed it in the place she kept such observations, which was not a place of anger but a place of information. They talked for an hour about the supply arrangement, and about the Harwick Falls market, and about the direction of the textile finishing trade, and she found him, underneath the manner, genuinely knowledgeable about the commercial side of the business in ways that complemented rather than duplicated what she knew. And she found the conversation more useful than she had expected. And when he asked if he could call again, she said he could. He called again. He called several more times across the following months, and the professional visits became social ones alongside the commercial ones, and the social ones produced, over time, a friendship that was real in the way that friendships between people with complementary minds are real, grounded in the genuine pleasure of talking to someone who understands what you are talking about, and who adds to the understanding, rather than merely receiving it. Frances, who had very few friendships of this kind in Harwick Falls, because the town's social geography had not made them easy to develop, valued it in proportion to its rarity. By the end of 1875, Arthur Kane had left the Philadelphia supplier and was proposing a business partnership. He proposed it with the specific fluency he brought to all proposals, laying out the logic of it clearly and in terms that addressed the practical questions rather than the personal ones. He had commercial connections in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that her business did not have access to. She had operational expertise and an established customer base, and a quality reputation that he could not replicate without her. Together, he argued, they could expand Holt's Finishing from a local operation into a regional one, taking on the larger orders that she currently had to decline because her capacity was insufficient and her commercial reach was limited. She considered it for 3 months. She considered it with the same careful attention she gave to all major decisions, examining the proposal from every angle she could identify, assessing what she would gain and what she would give up and what the risks were, and how she would manage them. She spoke with her solicitor, a man named Mr. George Alderton, who had handled the legal aspects of her lease arrangements, and who was a careful man of sound, practical advice. Alderton raised 2 concerns. The first was the question of control, specifically how decisions would be made and what her authority would be in a situation of disagreement. The second was the question of the partnership's legal structure, specifically what her position would be if the partnership dissolved, and how the assets that she had built would be protected. She raised both questions with Arthur. He addressed them with the fluency she had come to associate with him, proposing a partnership agreement that specified decision-making authority and asset ownership in terms that Alderton reviewed and found reasonable. She noted later, when she was reviewing the events of those months from the considerable distance of 20 years, that what she had assessed with great care was the legal structure of the agreement and the commercial logic of the proposal, and what she had assessed with insufficient care was Arthur Kane himself, the specific quality of a man who had presented himself across 18 months as one kind of person, and who was, beneath the presentation, a different kind. She signed the partnership agreement in January of 1876. The business became Holt and Kane Finishing. Arthur's commercial connections were real. This she would always acknowledge, even in the years when acknowledging anything real about him cost her something. He did have relationships in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. He did open doors to the larger orders that her reputation and quality had merited, but that her reach had not previously been able to access. In the 18 months after the partnership formed, the business grew in ways that would not have been possible without what he brought to it. And the growth was real, and the contribution was real, and she was, in those 18 months, genuinely satisfied with what they had built together. The first sign was so small that she almost missed it. In the summer of 1877, in the course of reviewing the accounts for the previous quarter, she found a discrepancy. Not a large one, a small one, the kind that could have been an error in addition or a misrecorded entry. The kind that a person who is not paying very close attention might have accepted as a minor administrative mistake and corrected without examining further. Frances paid very close attention to her accounts. She had paid very close attention to her accounts since the day she opened Holt's Finishing in 1871, and she had not made errors in addition, and she did not accept misrecorded entries without understanding what had been misrecorded and why. She traced the discrepancy to a payment made by Arthur from the business account to an entity she did not recognize, described in the accounts as a commission payment to a commercial agent whose name she had not encountered in any of the business correspondence she was party to. The amount was not large. The fact of it was, she asked Arthur about it directly. He explained it with the fluency he brought to all explanations, describing the agent as a Pittsburgh connection through whom a significant new order had been sourced, explaining that the commission had been agreed before the order was finalized, and that he had intended to tell her but had entered it in the accounts first in the interest of accuracy. She listened to the explanation and noted that it was plausible, and that plausible was not the same as true, and that the distinction between plausible and true was one she was going to need to be considerably more attentive to than she had been. She started keeping a second set of records, not from the beginning of the partnership, which was not recoverable, but from the summer of 1877 forward, a parallel record of every transaction she could access, every payment and receipt and commission and expense, kept in a small notebook that she maintained at home rather than at the business, and that she did not tell Arthur about. She did this with the patient, methodical care of a woman who has identified a problem, and who is assessing its full extent before deciding what to do about it, which requires information, and information requires time. What she found over the following year was not a single large crime, but a pattern of small ones. Payments to agents and suppliers that were real in their form but inflated in their amounts. The difference between the legitimate cost and the recorded cost moving through channels she was tracing with increasing clarity to Arthur's personal benefit. Commissions on new orders that were recorded at rates above what the partnership agreement specified. The excess unaccounted for in any record she could find. A gradual shift in the customer relationships. The new accounts that Arthur had brought now dealing almost exclusively through him. Their correspondence directed to him personally rather than to the partnership. Their loyalty building to him rather than to the business, in ways she was beginning to understand, were being cultivated deliberately. She went back to Alderton in the autumn of 1878 with her notebook. She sat in his office and laid it on his desk and explained what she had found and what she believed it meant. Alderton read through the notebook with the focused attention of a careful man who is seeing something he expected not to see, and who is reorganizing his assessment accordingly. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her and said that what she had documented was concerning, and that it was not yet sufficient for a legal action, but that it was a foundation on which a legal action could be built if the pattern continued, and if she continued documenting it. She asked what she should do. He said she had two options, She could confront Arthur with what she had found and attempt to renegotiate the partnership on terms that gave her more oversight and more protection. Or she could continue documenting, build the case more completely, and bring an action when the documentation was sufficient to support one. He said the first option was faster and more direct and gave Arthur the opportunity to cover his tracks. He said the second option was slower and required her to continue in a partnership she had reason to distrust, but that it produced a stronger case and a better legal position. She chose the second option. She chose it because she was not a woman who moved before she was ready, and because she understood that a legal case built on a year of documentation was worth more than a confrontation built on a suspicion, and because she was, in the specific and patient way of someone who has built something from nothing over 7 years, willing to take the time that the stronger position required. She was also watching something else. She was watching the customer relationships that Arthur had been cultivating, watching the way the new accounts had been structured, watching the direction in which the business's identity was moving. And what she was watching was the gradual, deliberate replacement of Holt's finishing with a different business. Not a dramatic overnight change. A slow, careful repositioning. The stationery that had said Holt and Kane Finishing was running low, and the new stationery that Arthur had ordered while she was visiting a supplier said Kane and Associates. The sign above the door that had said Holt and Kane in equal lettering had been repainted while she was away for a week in Dunmore visiting her mother, and the new sign said Kane Finishing in larger lettering with and Associates beneath it in smaller type. She came back from Dunmore and stood in front of the sign and felt something cold and specific settle in the place below her sternum, and she said nothing, not yet, and went inside and sat at her desk and made a note in her notebook. In June of 1879, Arthur Kane told her that he was buying her out of the partnership. He did it in the office with the door closed and the professional manner that was his most reliable tool, presenting it as a business decision, a matter of commercial logic, explaining that the partnership's direction required a single decision-making authority, and that he was prepared to offer her a fair valuation of her share of the current business in exchange for her withdrawal. He named a figure. The figure was not fair. It was an assessment of the business's current value that was roughly 1/3 of what Alderton had told her the business was worth, and it did not include any recognition of the original business she had built before the partnership formed, which was the foundation on which everything subsequent had been built. She looked at him across the desk, with the full attention she had been giving him for 5 years, the attention that had begun as professional assessment and had become something colder and more specific over the 18 months of careful documentation. And she said she would need to think about it, and that she would speak with her solicitor. He said he hoped she would be reasonable. She said she always was. She went to Alderton that afternoon with her notebook. Alderton read the accumulated documentation and said that she had, in the 18 months since their first conversation about the discrepancies, built a case that he believed was actionable. He said that the figure Arthur had offered was not acceptable, and that she should not accept it, and that she had grounds for a legal action that would produce a significantly better outcome than the offered settlement. He said the case was not without difficulty because the partnership agreement, while it had protected her interests at the time it was drafted, had been operated by Arthur in ways that had gradually shifted the business's legal and commercial identity in his direction, and that reversing that shift through legal action would take time and would not be without cost. She said she understood that. He asked how far she was willing to take it. She said as far as it needed to go. The legal action that Frances Holt filed against Arthur Kane in the autumn of 1879 was the beginning of a process that would occupy her, at varying levels of intensity, for the next 20 years. This requires saying plainly, because the stories that condense 20 years into a paragraph do not do justice to what 20 years actually is, to the specific weight of a 2-decade project undertaken by a woman who has been wronged, and who has decided that the wrongdoing is going to be addressed regardless of the time it takes. 20 years is not a dramatic arc. It is a sustained, daily, relentless application of patience and intelligence, and the specific refusal to be managed into a settlement that does not reflect what was actually taken. The first legal action produced a partial settlement, partial in the specific sense of not reflecting what she had built and what had been taken from it, but better than the figure Arthur had offered and sufficient to establish, in the legal record, that the partnership had been operated in ways that violated the partnership agreement, and that Frances Holt had had an actionable claim. Arthur paid the settlement with the expression of a man who has managed a situation to an outcome he can work with, and who intends to continue working. He retained the business, now operating fully as Kane Finishing, with the customer relationships and the operational infrastructure, and the reputation that Frances had built across 8 years, and that he had spent 3 years repositioning under his name. She was 30 years old, and she had been left with a settlement that was less than the value of the business she had started, a legal record that established her claim without restoring it, and the specific quality of a woman who has understood that the first round of a long contest has ended, and that the contest is not over. She built again. This was, in retrospect, the thing that Arthur Kane had not adequately accounted for when he had assessed his position in the autumn of 1879. He had assessed the business and the legal situation, and he had not adequately assessed Frances, which was the same mistake that people who underestimate women make consistently, and which has the same consistent consequence, which is that they are eventually, to their considerable surprise, wrong. She opened a new operation in 1880, this time alone, with no partner and no intention of ever having a partner again. She called it Holt's simply, with the possessive that made clear whose it was, and she opened it in a space on the western side of the mill district that was smaller than what she had grown Holt and Kane into, but that was hers in every sense of the word, and that she intended to keep that way. She had the settlement money, and she had 8 years of operational knowledge, and she had the customer relationships that she had personally built and maintained, and that Arthur had not succeeded in fully transferring to himself, because the customers who had known her since the beginning of her business knew the difference between the work and the name on the sign. 3 of her original customers followed her to Holt's within the first 6 months. This was not an accident. She had maintained those relationships with the specific care of a woman who understands that relationships are assets, and that assets are worth protecting. She had not solicited them during the partnership dispute because soliciting them would have given Arthur grounds for a counterclaim. She had simply been present and professional and reliable, and had left the door open, and the 3 customers who mattered most had walked through it when she opened it. She ran Holt's for the next decade with the focused competence of a woman who has learned everything the hard way and intends to apply every lesson. She grew it steadily, not dramatically, not in the way that attracts the attention that Arthur's kind of attention creates trouble with, but in the real way of a business that serves its customers well and is managed with the precision of someone who has seen what happens when the management is delegated and does not intend to delegate it again. By 1890, she had 14 employees and an operation that was the equal in volume and the superior in quality to what Kane Finishing had become under Arthur's management of it. She was also watching Kane Finishing. She had been watching it since the settlement, not with the obsessive attention of a woman consumed by grievance, but with the specific, periodic attention of a woman who is waiting for the right moment, and who understands that the right moment requires conditions that she cannot force but can be prepared for when they arrive. She watched Arthur's management of the business, and she watched the customer relationships, and she watched the financial health of the operation, which she was able to assess through the public records and through the information that moved through the Harwick Falls business community in the way that information moves through small commercial ecosystems, incompletely but usefully. What she saw over the decade after the settlement was that Kane Finishing was less well managed than Holt's Finishing had been. This was not surprising to her. She had built Holt's on the foundation of precise operational management, and Arthur had built Kane Finishing on the foundation of commercial relationships and sales fluency. And those were different foundations and produced different results over a decade of operation. The commercial fluency producing growth in the early years, and the operational imprecision producing erosion in the later ones. By 1888, Kane Finishing was showing the specific signs of a business that has been growing faster than its operational capacity can support. And by 1890, the signs were more specific, visible in the public records and in the quality complaints that were circulating among the mill operators in ways that reached Frances, because she had spent 2 decades building relationships in Harwick Falls that produced exactly this kind of information. She went back to Alderton in the autumn of 1890. Alderton was older and slower, but his judgment was as sound as it had ever been, and his knowledge of her case was as detailed as anyone's in Pennsylvania, because he had been her counsel through every step of it. She sat in his office and told him what she believed the current situation to be and what she thought it might be possible to do about it. What she had identified was this: the settlement of 1879 had established, in the legal record, that the original Holt's Finishing operation and its assets had been valued as part of the partnership dissolution. The valuation had been contested, and the settlement had been less than she had sought. But the legal record existed, and the legal record showed that the operational foundation of what became Kane Finishing had included assets built by Frances Holt before the partnership formed, assets that had been valued in the settlement at a figure she had accepted under legal advice as the best available outcome at the time. The acceptance of that settlement had not extinguished the underlying claim. It had settled the specific legal action. The underlying facts remained in the record. What had changed in the decades since was the additional documentation she had continued to accumulate, the ongoing record of the ways in which Arthur Kane had continued to use the operational infrastructure of the original Holt's Finishing in ways that exceeded what the settlement had addressed, the customer relationships he had transferred, the operational processes she had developed, the specific finishing techniques she had refined over years of practice that were now the basis of Kane Finishing's reputation in ways that a careful analysis of the timeline could demonstrate. Alderton said it was a difficult case. He said it was not impossible. He said it required a specific legal argument about the ongoing commercial use of original assets and the inadequacy of the original settlement in addressing the full extent of those assets, and that the argument was more viable now than it had been in 1879, because the subsequent decade had produced additional evidence of the scope of what had been used. He said it would take several years and would be contested vigorously and would not be cheap. She said she understood all of that. He asked, as he had asked 15 years before, how far she was willing to take it. She gave him the same answer she had given him then. The second legal action, filed in the spring of 1891, ran through the Pennsylvania courts for 4 years. It was not, in its legal particulars, a simple case, and it was not presented to the court as one. Alderton had built it carefully across the years of Frances's documentation and his own preparation, and it was the kind of case that required the court to look at a long history and a detailed record, and to assess the full extent of what had been built and what had been taken, and what the settlement of 1879 had and had not addressed. Arthur Kane retained a Philadelphia law firm of considerable reputation, and the defense was conducted with the resources of a man who had spent 15 years profiting from something that was not fully his, and who understood that the case threatened everything he had built on that profit. Frances attended every hearing. She sat in the Harwick Falls courthouse through 4 years of legal proceedings with the same composed, specific attention she had brought to everything for 30 years. The attention of a woman who has paid close attention to everything around her since she was a child, watching her mother manage a household with insufficient resources, and who has never stopped paying that attention regardless of what it cost her to maintain it. She answered every question put to her with precision and without emotion, because emotion in a courtroom in 1891 Pennsylvania was something that a woman could not afford if she wanted to be heard as a commercial actor rather than a grieved personal one. And she wanted to be heard as what she was, which was a business person who had built something and documented what had been done with it, and who was presenting the documentation. The court found in her favor in June of 1895. The finding was not everything she had sought. Legal findings in complex commercial cases rarely are. But it was a finding that established that the settlement of 1879 had not adequately addressed the full extent of the assets of the original Holt's finishing operation that had been incorporated into Kane Finishing, and it awarded her a supplemental settlement that, combined with the original one, brought the total she had received closer to the actual value of what she had built. It required Kane Finishing to return certain customer accounts that were demonstrably developed from the original Holt's customer base. It required Arthur Kane to pay her legal costs. It required, in a provision that Alderton had argued for specifically, and that Frances had wanted specifically, a correction to the public commercial record of Harwick Falls that acknowledged the founding history of the business that had become Kane Finishing, and the role of Frances Holt in establishing it. Arthur Kane sold Kane Finishing in 1896, the year after the judgment, to a textile group from Pittsburgh that absorbed it into a larger operation, and which had, within 3 years, replaced the sign above the door with the group's own name, so that Kane's name was gone from the building he had put it on, in the end, as completely as he had tried to remove hers. She did not feel triumph at this. She felt the specific quality of a long thing finished, which is different from triumph and more durable. Triumph is a moment. The end of a long thing is a condition. A new condition in which the weight that has been present for so long that it has shaped the posture of everything you do is finally absent, and the absence requires its own adjustment, its own period of learning to stand without the weight that has been the structure of your standing. She ran Holt's until 1899, when she sold it on her own terms, at a valuation she set herself, to a woman from the next town who had been apprenticed in the trade, and who came to her with the specific quality Frances had recognized in herself 30 years before, the quality of someone who has paid close attention to the economic world around them and has identified a gap, and has the intention and the capability to fill it. She sold it to her at a price that reflected the business's value, and on terms that she negotiated with the care she brought to all negotiations. And she handed over the keys and the accounts and the customer ledgers and the operational procedures that she had developed across 28 years of building and rebuilding. And she walked out of the building on the western side of Harwick Falls Mill District for the last time, with the specific lightness of a woman who has set down a thing she carried for a very long time, and who is, now, free of it. The sign above the door said Holt's. It said it in the lettering she had chosen, and the color she had specified, and the size she had determined was right for the space. And it said it because she had built the business it named and had kept it and had come back to it and had kept it again. And because there was nothing in the world that had been sufficient to take her name permanently from something she had built. Not a partnership that turned to theft, and not a legal system that had required years of patient argument, and not a man who had believed, at the moment of his confidence, that what he had acquired was fully his. It had never been fully his. She had always known this. She had known it on the day she stood in front of the repainted sign that said Kane Finishing and felt the cold, specific thing settle in the place below her sternum, and said nothing, and went inside and made a note in her notebook. She had known it through every year of the long contest, and through the first settlement, and through the building of Holt's, and through the second action, and through the 4 years of hearings, and through the judgment, and through the sale, and through the walk out of the building for the last time. It had never been fully his because it was built from something that was fully hers, built from the intelligence her mother had shown her, and the market knowledge she had built herself, and the specific, relentless refusal to accept a limit that she had not examined and found to be genuinely immovable. She was 50 years old when she sold Holt's in 1899. She lived for another 23 years, in a house on the eastern side of Harwick Falls that she owned outright. And she spent those years in the specific freedom of a woman who has nothing left to prove, and nothing left to fight for, and who finds, in the absence of both, a quality of life that she had not had the leisure to fully inhabit while the proving and the fighting were ongoing. She kept her accounts. She kept her garden. She corresponded with the woman who had bought Holt's and who wrote to her periodically with questions and with updates about the business's development. And she answered the questions with the precision and the generosity of someone who has been given a great deal by the work of her life, and who is willing to give what she knows to the person who is doing that work now. She died in 1922 at the age of 73, in the house on the eastern side of Harwick Falls. And she left behind the house and the savings and the accounts and the correspondence and the notebook, the small notebook she had started in the summer of 1877, when she found the first discrepancy, and had continued, in various replacements of the original, across the 22 years of the contest and the 23 years after it. A document of a life conducted with great precision and great patience, in the full knowledge of what it was worth, and the full refusal to accept anything less. The notebook is in the possession of her great-niece in Pennsylvania. It has not been published. It is a private document and a personal one, full of the specific, technical language of commercial accounts and legal records, and the occasional observation about the business and the people in it that its keeper allowed herself in the margins when the margins had space. It is not literature. It is something more useful than literature. It is the record of a woman who paid close attention to the world around her for 73 years, and who wrote down what she saw, and who built from what she saw and what she wrote something that was, in the end, unremovable, because it was built from the one material that cannot be taken from the person who possesses it. The intelligence, the patience, the specific, clear-eyed refusal to accept that what she had built was not hers, those were always hers. They were hers on the day she arrived in Harwick Falls with her savings and her market knowledge and her intention. And they were hers on the day she walked out of Holt's for the last time. And they were hers on the day she died in the house on the eastern side of the town she had chosen and stayed in and fought in and built in and kept. Everything else could be contested and recovered and contested again. Those were never in question.